Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien, and in this video I'm going to be going through Malcolm X's very famous speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. That was delivered April 12th, 1964. And again, you're going to hear his same skills at rallying the crowd behind him, his same rhetorical skills and being very conversational yet being very articulate. You're going to hear some of the same like good old riffs he used to use, especially in the beginning. But again, you will hear different things. In addition, you will hear different things versus what he was saying in the first few essays or speeches we listened to or read. All right. So for this one, I have a YouTube video that again is just it's not a still photograph this time, but the images are nothing to do with Malcolm delivering the speech, at least not the actual place and time. All right, it's just generic images from the era. So you can just follow along with the audio either in your packet or on the screen as we listen to it. And I'm going to stop and answer questions as we can. And I'm going to read the head note before we actually begin the ballot or the bullet. So please scroll up or move up in your packet to the head note. So part of Malcolm's allure for the African Americans too was his daredevil swagger and bristling, defiant manner before whites. Many Nation of Islam blacks admired his courage and got a vicarious thrill watching him fearlessly denounce whites for their depravity. Many were gratified when hearing him forcefully, brilliantly articulate the bitter resentments and rage that most African Americans felt on some level toward whites, but were too afraid or too complacent to express. So he was willing to say what they wouldn't say. And from seeing the visible discomfort and alarm register on the faces of his shocked white listeners. So Malcolm drew on his vast reading for social historical facts about slavery and lynching to build a virtually undeniable case about the historically undeniable case about the evils of whites and their conduct toward blacks. Even when mainstream civil rights activists who adamantly disagreed with him about the problem's solution more or less agreed with his diagnosis of the chief problem facing African Americans, which was whites' evil racism. So although he made many of its points elsewhere, this speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, was Malcolm's fullest statement of his political strategy of using African American voting power to bring positive near-term changes for them. He made a major concession to the mainstream civil rights agenda when he confirmed the value of obtaining and leveraging black civil political rights. The power of voting is what you're going to see here. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's, SNCC's, 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project focused on voter registration among Deep South blacks, which you've learned about. Malcolm in 65 voiced his approval of SNCC and King's voting rights goals and offered to help protect King and nonviolent demonstrators in their efforts in Selma, Alabama. In this speech, Malcolm stressed his new willingness to join with all black groups in the quest for civil rights. But for all such change, he was still in many respects his usual militant self. I'm not talking about, it wasn't raging violent. I mean, his words, his tone. If the government failed to enforce blacks' voting rights and to protect them from racist violence, Malcolm warned, African Americans would justifiably turn to the bullet instead. Hence the name of the speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. You either listen to us at the ballot, or you may wind up with the bullet. He wasn't making a threat. He was making a prediction. So even while advocating the Nation of Islam, however, Malcolm began to chafe under Elijah Muhammad's strict prohibitions against his followers engaging in any protests against white authorities. So we're rewinding a little bit before Malcolm left the Nation of Islam. So this is before even his Hajj. By 63, Malcolm wished seriously to engage in the civil rights movement. Jealousy over Malcolm's celebrity by Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm had become more famous than Elijah Muhammad. So there was like a tense, jealous relationship there. So jealousy over Malcolm's celebrity and concern about his potential independent power began to grow within Muhammad's Chicago-based inner circle. Malcolm's relationship with the Nation of Islam was further strained when Malcolm heard reports that Muhammad himself had been breaking the Nation of Islam's strict moral code by having children by several young women. And going off script here, in addition to that, Elijah Muhammad became extremely wealthy from the Nation of Islam. So there was also, some historians argue that he exploited the situation. So following the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963, Muhammad used the opportunity to silence Malcolm, saying that the minister's remark that the incident was evidence, quote, evidence of, quote, chickens coming home to roost, the assassination. That comment by Malcolm violated Muhammad's instructions not to speak ill of the slain president. So while under official Nation of Islam discipline, Malcolm traveled abroad, this is his Hajj, to Africa and the Middle East, which broadened his perspective on his faith and on the international struggle of darker peoples. In 1964, Malcolm made a Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. There he was moved by the sight of Muslims of all colors from many nations meeting in common devotion to Allah. During this period of profound religious and ideological reorientation, Malcolm converted to Orthodox Sunni Islam. Just weeks before shaking hands with King at the U.S. Capitol, this is just weeks before that famous handshake, the meeting we talked about when we opened this packet, Malcolm publicly broke with the Nation of Islam, and he founded what was called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. And he announced his intent to form a black nationalist movement aimed at heightening political consciousness and activity among African Americans. Malcolm's new program included supporting the activities of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, because Dr. King was still down south, he wasn't up north yet, aligning himself especially with local grassroots activists and the movement's more militant groups such as SNCC. All right. Malcolm even showed up in Birmingham in '63 during that Children's Crusade. He was convinced by Coretta Scott King. Well, that's who he met. He didn't meet Dr. King in Birmingham. He met with Coretta, his wife. And in that conversation, Malcolm asked Coretta if he wanted help or if he wanted Malcolm to leave, if King wanted Malcolm to leave. And they thought it was best if Malcolm left. All right. But here we go. This is the ballot or the bullet. Again, you can follow along in your packet or you can follow along on the screen. It does not really matter. And I should say the audio isn't the best on this.
Whether you are a Christian or a Muslim or a nationalist, we all have the same problem. They don't hang you because you're a Baptist. They hang you because you're blind. They don't attack me because I'm a Muslim. They attack me because I'm blind. They attack all of us for the same reason. All of us catch hell from the same enemy. We're all in the same bag, in the same boat. We suffer political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation. All of them from the same enemy. The government has failed us. You can't deny that. Anytime you live in the 20th century and you walking around here singing, "We shall overcome," the government has failed. This is part of what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. Today it's time to stop singing and start swinging. You can't sing up on freedom, but you can swing up on some freedom. Cassius Clay can sing, but singing didn't help him to become the heavyweight champion of the world.
Muhammad Ali.
But this government has failed us. Government itself has failed us. And the white liberals who have been posing as our friends have failed us. And once we see that all these other sources to which we've turned have failed, we stop turning to them and turn to ourselves. We need a self-help program, a do-it-yourself philosophy, a do-it-right now philosophy. It's already too late philosophy. This is what you and I need to get with. And the only way we're going to solve our problem is with a self-help program. Before we can get a self-help program started, we have to have a self-help philosophy. Black nationalism is a self-help philosophy. What's so good about it, you can stay right in the church where you are and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. You can stay in any kind of civic organization that you belong to and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. You can be an atheist and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. This is a philosophy that eliminates the necessity for division and argument. Because if you're black, you should be thinking black. And if you're black and you're not thinking black at this late date, well, I'm sorry for you. Once you change your philosophy, you change your thought pattern.
Okay, so we can actually answer a few questions. So the first question is pretty easy. Okay, after leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X wanted to solve the problems of Black Americans by minimizing the differences between Black Americans. What did he say? Was there a common problem? All right, and this is similar to an earlier speech that we listened to. They all have a common oppressor, white people. All right, and that's what you see in the first paragraph here. Whether you are a Christian or a Muslim or a nationalist, we all have the same problem. And this is a riff that you saw in the previous speech. They don't hang you because you're a Baptist, they hang you because you're black. They don't attack me because I'm a Muslim, they attack me because I'm black. All right, so they're all in the same boat, he's basically saying. And they need to help themselves. All right, so if we go to the second question, all right, does Malcolm X think either the Democrat or Republican Party wants to help Black America? Let's skip that one for now. But if you go down to, here's the question, what does Malcolm say about the philosophy of Black nationalism? All right, we can answer that one. I don't know why I put it down there as the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th question, but this is the 5th question I'm talking about. He basically talks about it being a self-help philosophy and being all-inclusive. All right, regardless of your class, your religion, your background, what have you. All right, so he brings up Liv. He brings up the idea that both parties have failed them, but he goes into more depth later in the speech. That's why I kind of skipped that question. But it goes on to say, once you realize that both parties have failed them, okay, if you look at this paragraph that begins, and once we see that all these other sources to which we have turned have failed, we stop turning to them, meaning Republicans or Democrats, and turn to ourselves. And here's where he describes Black nationalism. He calls it a self-help program, a do-it-yourself philosophy, a do-it-right-now philosophy, and it's already too late philosophy. This is what you and I need to get with, and the only way we're going to solve our problem is with a self-help program. All right, before we can get a self-help program started, we have to have a self-help philosophy. We've got to think it before we can do it. And he goes on to say, Black nationalism is a self-help philosophy. What's so good about it? You can be anywhere and be a Black nationalist. You can stay right here in this church and be a Black nationalist. You can be in any civic organization and be a Black nationalist. You can be religious or an atheist and be a Black nationalist. All right. And when he talks about self-help philosophy, he's talking about a focus on the Black communities. All right. Electing Black politicians, patronizing Black businesses, right? Helping out Black schools. All right. So on and so forth. So it's a focus on economic, political, and community investment in your neighborhood. Okay. So again, he calls it a self-help philosophy, and that's the answer to that 5th question. Okay, so we're at the paragraph that begins, once you change your philosophy, you change your thought pattern. And this is going to bring us to the next question.
Once you change your thought pattern, you change your attitude. Once you change your attitude, it changes your behavior pattern. And then you go on into some action. As long as you got a sit-down philosophy, you'll have a sit-down thought pattern.
Talking about the civil rights movement.
As long as you think that old sit-down thought, you'll be in some kind of sit-down everywhere. It's not so good to refer to what you're going to do as a sit-in. Then right there castrates you. Right there it brings you down. What goes with it? Think of the image of someone sitting. An old woman can sit. An old man can sit. A chump can sit. A coward can sit. Anything can sit. Well, you and I have been sitting long enough, and it's time today for us to start doing some standing and some fighting to back that up. When we look at other parts of this earth upon which we live, we find that black, brown, red, and yellow people in Africa and Asia are getting their independence. They're not getting it by singing, "We shall overcome." No, they're getting it through nationalism. It is nationalism that brought about the independence of the people in Asia. Every nation in Asia gained its independence through the philosophy of nationalism. Every nation on the African continent that has gotten its independence brought it about through the philosophy of nationalism. And it will take black nationalism that to bring about the freedom of 22 million Afro-Americans here in this country where we have suffered colonialism for the past 400 years. America is just as much a colonial power as England ever was. America is just as much a colonial power as France ever was. In fact, America is more so a colonial power than they, because she's a hypocritical colonial power behind it. What do you call second-class citizenship? Why, that's colonization. Second-class citizenship is nothing but 20th century slavery. How are you going to tell me you're a second-class citizen? They don't have second-class citizenship in any other government on this earth. They just have slaves and people who are free. Well, this country is a hypocrite. They try and make you think they set you free by calling you a second-class citizen. No, you're nothing but a 20th century slave.
All right. So again, this speech is a change from his previous bodies of work, but it will not be until the next document in which we see Malcolm change even more drastically. So, he's still talking about the weakness of the civil rights movement as being kind of cowardly. He begins to change that as we move along. All right. So if you look at question, why does Malcolm X not believe in the methods of Martin Luther King as a means of social reform? And he basically is arguing that they're not assertive enough, that, things like sitting in imply weakness. All right. And he also talked about how fighting back has worked elsewhere in the world. So he's not backing down on his retaliatory self-defense. Okay, what he has changed, what he has jettisoned, is his talk about violent revolution and complete separation. Okay, so now he's talking, instead of complete separation, he's talking about black power within their communities. Okay, one thing I do want to point out, and I'd like you to mark up, is this talk about colonization. All right, where is it? Let me find it. Okay, he wants this last sentence in the paragraph that begins, once you change your philosophy, right? He says that he wants to bring about the freedom of 22 million Afro-Americans here in this country, where we have suffered colonialism for the past 400 years. And it would be great if in your final paper you talk about how he doesn't just mean, geographically or materially. He's talking about psychologically too. What has been done to the psychology of the African American and what they feel about themselves, what they've been taught to feel about themselves by white people. Okay. So again, he thinks Martin Luther King's methods are not assertive enough. All right. That sitting in and just fighting for second-class citizenship isn't enough. Okay. All right. So we can go on to the next section. All right. Let's start the audio again.
I'm no politician. I'm not even a student of politics. I'm not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American, and got sense enough to know it. I'm one of the 22 million black victims of the Democrats. One of the 22 million black victims of the Republicans, and one of the 22 million black victims of Americanism.
Live.
And when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat or a Republican, nor an American. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. You and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. When we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see America through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of Americanism. We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare.
All right. Please mark that up in your packets. All right. Referring to not as the American dream, but the American nightmare, because later in the packet, when we're talking about Dr. King, who's very famous for, as I think you know, saying, "I have a dream," all right, in the last few months of his life, was interviewed, I think it was by NBC News up in Chicago, and he made the statement, my dream has turned into a nightmare. All right, remember, that's one of the themes of your essay, how they began to be more like each other. All right, and that's a very glaring example. All right, so let's continue with the speech.
We haven't benefited from America's democracy. We've only suffered from America's hypocrisy. And the generation that's coming up now can see it and are not afraid to say it. If you go to jail, so what? If you're black, you were born in jail. If you black, you were born in jail. In the North as well as the South. Stop talking about the South. Long as you south of the Canadian border, you're South. Don't call Governor Wallace a Dixie governor. Romney is a Dixie governor.
All right, he's talking about Mitt Romney's dad, George Romney, who was, I believe at that time, he was the governor of Michigan.
22 million black victims of Americanism are waking up, and they're gaining a new political consciousness, becoming politically mature. And as they develop this political maturity, they're able to see the recent trends in these political elections. They see that the whites are so evenly divided that every time they vote, the race is so close, they have to go back and count the votes all over again. And which means that any block...
So listen very carefully. He's talking about electoral strategies here.
Any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who go to the White House and who stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to his Texas cotton patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they've brought it up and gotten it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first, and they put you last. Because you're a chump.
Okay, so again, this goes back to the question about both political parties. Who he thinks both parties failed them. Obviously, the Republican Party, who did not support civil rights, had failed them, he would argue. But he would say the Democrats also failed them. You know, we get them elected, we put them in the White House, they make all these promises on the campaign trail, and then they put us to the bottom of the to-do list once they get into office. All right. So again, call them kind of hypocrites. So that would be the answer to the second question. Does Malcolm X think either the Democratic or Republican Party wants to help blacks in America? No. So now we're up to the paragraph that begins in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives.
A political chump. In Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives, there are 257 who are Democrats. Only 177 are Republican. In the Senate, there are 67 Democrats. Only 33 are Republicans. The party that you backed controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives in the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you because you're a chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Right. So now he gives a more specific political reason why he thinks the Democrats have failed them. Go back to that question. They control 2/3 of the government, yet they claim they still can't keep their promise because they're being blocked by opponents of civil rights. Right? So he thinks the Democratic Party has failed them. In the next paragraph, he goes into this in even more depth.
And what kind of alibi do they come up with?
What excuse?
They try and pass the buck to the Dixiecrats.
That's the excuse the Democrats
now,
made.
during the days when you were blind, deaf, and dumb, ignorant, politically immature, naturally you went along with that. But today, as your eyes come open and you develop political maturity, you're able to see and think for yourself. And you can see that a Dixiecrat is nothing but a Democrat in disguise.
All right. By Dixiecrat, he means a Southern Democrat who's an opponent of civil rights, like an old school segregationist. And what he's going to be talking about in the next paragraph says how they are the Democratic Party. All right, they are not the exception. They are the party. These Dixiecrats.
You look at the structure of the government that controls this country. It's controlled by 16 senatorial committees and 20 congressional committees. Of the 16 senatorial committees that run the government, 10 of them are in the hands of Southern segregationists. Of the 20 congressional committees that run the government, 12 of them are in the hands of Southern segregationists. And they're going to tell you and me that the South lost the war. You today are in the hands of a government of segregationists, racists, white supremacists, who belong to the Democratic Party but disguise themselves as Dixiecrats. A Dixiecrat is nothing but a Democrat. Whoever runs the Democrats is also the father of the Dixiecrats. And the father of all of them is sitting in the White House. I say it again. You got a president who's nothing but a Southern segregationist. From the state of Texas. They'll lynch you in Texas as quick as they'll lynch you in Mississippi. Only in Texas, they lynch you with a Texas accent. In Mississippi, they lynch you with a Mississippi accent. And the first thing the cracker does when he comes in power, he takes all the Negro leaders and invites them for coffee to show that he's all right.
All right, a lot of stuff there. Okay, so again, he's talking about the failure of the Democratic Party here. So if you go up to the paragraph that begins, you look at the structure. So he's talking about the committees that are in the Senate and the committees that are in the House, right? So whenever anyone proposes a law, it first goes to every committee that has any type of oversight over that law. You know, so if the bill would spend any money from the discretionary budget, the Budgetary Committee gets it. If it affects foreign policy in any way, maybe the Senate Intelligence Committee or the Foreign Policy Committee get their hands on it. And there's a handful of senators in each of these committees. It's run by one senator and one member of the House, and they can change the proposal, and it will not leave the committee until it is approved by a majority of that committee. So what Democrats are claiming is they propose things, and then Dixiecrats get their hands on them, and they kind of water down all these civil rights bills. All right. What Malcolm X is arguing is, you know, there are 16 committees in the Senate. 10 of them are controlled by Southern segregationists. He points out there are 20 committees in the House. 12 of them are controlled by Southern Democrats, Southern segregationists. So he's basically saying that's the real Democratic Party. All right, Democrats disguised as Dixiecrats. All right, so he's saying that's who runs the party. You also got to remember that the committees are by seniority. The people who get to be on the most powerful committees and the people who get to be the chair of these most powerful committees are people who have been there for in the Senate, in the House for a long time. And remember what slavery and the Jim Crow in the South was meant to do. It was meant to ensure only certain types of people got elected, i.e., rich white guys. All right, they've been there for a long time. All right, when only white people in the South were able to vote, and they were reelected time and time and time and time again, and then they've accrued the seniority to run these committees. And that's what Malcolm is pointing out, saying we can't depend on either party here. Okay, and he's basically saying to white America, if you don't improve things, if we can't get things done through the ballot, it's gonna have to come to the bullet. And again, he's not making a threat; he's making a prediction. All right. All right. So that is the end of the question. Does he think either party wants to help blacks in America? Okay. Now, what are the political, economic, and social aspects of black nationalism? I kind of answered this when we talked about the question above it. So if you already have these things, you don't need to write it twice in your packet. But I do suggest you kind of cut it and paste it into that answer on your Google form. All right. So what are the aspects? Again, it's a encourage African American men and women to run for office. All right. Encourage community activism, community involvement, investment, economic investment in your community. Banks giving out loans to Black entrepreneurs, things like that. Okay. Um, so to help out your own community politically, economically, and socially. All right. Again, he called it a self-help program. Okay. Now let's look at the last question. And this, we're going to read the last part. I don't have an audio of that. But since Malcolm's pilgrimage to Mecca, he softened his stance against the white man. What evidence of that can you find in the April 3rd speech? He gave a very similar speech on April 3rd, because remember this, the speech we listened to was April 12th, but 9 days earlier, he gave a similar speech, but it had this part different. So if you go to the end, right above the end of the speech, right above the first question, here's the part from the April 3rd version that wasn't in the version from 9 days later. And he says, now in speaking like this, it doesn't mean that we're anti-white, but it does mean we're anti-exploitation, we're anti-degradation, we're anti-oppression. It's a very good line to have in your final paper. And if the white man doesn't want us to be anti-him, let him stop oppressing and exploiting and degrading us. There you have it right there. That's the answer. We're not anti-white, we're anti-exploitation. So if you don't want us to be anti-you, stop exploiting us, is what Malcolm is saying. All right, so there you have it. That's Ballot or the Bullet.